You've probably noticed that economists have a somewhat specific and specialized professional vocabulary. I've had a lot of students tell me over the years that learning economics is a lot like learning a foreign language. Just like when you're learning a foreign language, there's a moment when you stop translating in and out of the foreign language every time you read or speak, and instead your brain just starts thinking in the foreign language. Some of my students like to call this brainwashing. I like to think of it as learning. But, you say tomato, I say tomato. It's useful to know the terms in some basic sense because it helps you understand what economists are talking about. It helps you avoid being deceived by economists. And as that terminology of economics begins to make sense and your brain starts using it, you know that you're beginning to really absorb the topic. This lecture introduces and explains and applies the terminology that economists use when analyzing when a change in price causes a change in quantity demanded or supplied. And what happens if that change in price causes a bigger change in quantity demanded or supplied, or a smaller change in quantity demanded or supplied? This is the terminology of elasticity. Let's start by explaining what elasticity means to economists, and then discuss why this concept is really so very useful. In ordinary usage, if you say something is elastic or has high elasticity, it usually would mean it has a lot of stretchiness. Something is very elastic if it stretches or changes a lot. And the economic terminology is related. The elasticity of demand is defined as the percentage change in quantity divided by the percentage change in price. Now, when we talked about how economists see demand back in Lecture 3, we explained that demand was a relationship between price and quantity. The relationship was, as price went up, the quantity demanded went down. Now, the reasons were, if you recall, individuals would buy less when the price was higher. They would substitute toward other goods where possible. But elasticity of demand is a way of answering the question, well, just how much did the increase in price cause the quantity demanded to change? For example, if price went up 10%, would that cause the quantity demanded to fall by 50%? Or if price went up 10%, would it cause the quantity demanded to fall by only 2%? Is there a lot of change away from the good or the service where the price is going up, or is there not so much? Now, of course, in one case, quantity demanded changes a lot as the price rises. In the other, it might change barely at all. Now, a market where elasticity of demand is a large number, where the quantity demanded changes a lot in response to changes of price, is likely to look rather different than a market where it's a relatively small number. Similarly, the elasticity of supply is defined as the percentage change in quantity supplied divided by the percentage change in price. And once again, when we talked about how economists see supply back in Lecture 3, we explained that supply was a relationship between price and quantity. And the relationship was, as price went up, quantity supplied went up too. And remember, the reason for that was firms would gain a higher profit as the price went higher, and that would encourage them to supply a greater quantity. Well, elasticity of supply is a way of answering the question, just how much did an increase in price cause the quantity supplied to change? If the price went up, say, 10%, does the quantity supplied rise 50%? Or if the price went up 10%, does the quantity supplied only go up by maybe 2%? In one case, the quantity supplied rises a lot as the price goes up. In the other case, it barely rises at all. And again, a market with a high elasticity of supply is likely to look quite a bit different from a market with a low elasticity of supply. Now, when we think about elasticity and we think about measuring elasticity, you can calculate a numerical figure for elasticity, but it's more useful to think about it sort of in terms of broad categories. So let me talk about three broad categories for thinking about elasticity, which are sort of the common ways in which economists use the term. Inelastic refers to a situation where the elasticity is less than 1. What that means is, if you think about the formula, a given percentage change in price causes a smaller percentage change in the quantity demanded. So, for example, a 10% rise in price might cause the quantity demanded to fall by only 5% or only 1%. Now, what's a classic example of a good where demand is highly inelastic? An example would be something like, how much does a diabetic demand insulin? Someone with a sickness that has a certain product that really treats that quite well knows that even with a higher price, they may trim back a little bit. They might try and reduce their dosage a little bit as the price goes way up, but they're not going to trim back very much. Their demand is inelastic in that way. It's not very stretchy. Or you could imagine someone who is addicted to cigarettes, a smoker who's got a big habit. Now, even with a higher price, that person might trim back a little, but if their demand is really inelastic, they're not going to trim back too much in response to the higher price. So demand tends to be inelastic when it's hard for people to substitute to another good very easily. Now, the flip side from inelastic would be something that is very elastic. Elastic refers to a situation where the elasticity is greater than 1. And again, if you think about that in terms of the formula, what that means is that a given percentage change in price will cause a larger percentage change in the quantity demanded. So, for example, a 10% rise in price might cause a 20 or a 30% fall in the quantity demanded. To put it a different way, the quantity demanded is highly stretchy when it's highly elastic. It moves a lot in response to changes in price. A classic example might be something like orange juice. If the price of orange juice went up quite sharply, people will shift to other juices, they'll shift to other fruits, they'll shift to vitamin C pills, but it's not hard to shift away from orange juice for most people. And so demand for orange juice will adjust quite a lot in response to changes in price. Now, the third example is the in-between case. It's right between inelastic and elastic, and it's called unitary elasticity. It's called unitary elasticity because elasticity is 1. And again, in terms of that formula, it means that a given percentage change in price causes an equal percentage change in quantity demanded. If the price went up 10%, the quantity demanded falls 10%. And so the elasticity would be equal to 1 in that case. Now, these ideas of elastic, inelastic, unitary elasticity also apply to supply. They don't just apply to demand. So let's think them through just in terms of supply and also try and sort of nail down these concepts. Inelastic supply refers to a situation where elasticity is less than 1. So a given percentage change in price will bring a smaller percentage change in the quantity supplied. For example, the price goes up 10%, but the quantity supplied only goes up maybe 5% or perhaps 1%. A classic example of a good where supply is highly inelastic would be, say, paintings by Pablo Picasso. No matter how much the price goes up, we are not getting any more paintings by Pablo Picasso. There is what there is. The quantity supplied is not going to move. In general, anything where it's difficult for firms to expand their supply easily or to expand their supply in an unbounded way is going to have a situation where it'll be a fairly inelastic supply. The other side, elastic supply, refers to a situation where the elasticity is greater than 1. And in that situation, a given percentage change in price will bring a larger percentage change in the quantity supplied. So, for example, a 10% rise in price might cause a 20% or a 30% rise in the quantity supplied. The quantity supplied is highly stretchy, again. A classic example would be any product where it's pretty easy to ramp up production very quickly. For example, if the economy was in a situation or an industry was in a situation where a lot of factories in that industry were only running at about 50% capacity, then those factories in that industry could ramp up production very, very quickly if they needed to do so. Or if it's a service that's pretty easy for existing firms to shift toward providing more of, then the elasticity of supply will be high. For example, say that there's a a convention happening in a certain city, a big political convention or the Super Bowl or some big event like that, and a lot more people are going to want to rent cars in that city. Well, if the price of renting a car in that city is going up, rental car companies can shift a lot more rental cars into that city fairly quickly. And so the elasticity of supply of providing more rental cars in a certain city is likely to be pretty high. And again, the in-between case, in between inelastic and elastic, is called unitary elasticity. That's where elasticity is 1. What that would mean in terms of the formula would be that a given percentage change in price would cause an equal percentage change in the quantity supplied. So a 10% rise in the price would bring a 10% rise in the quantity supplied. Now, why do we use these percentages? Why is elasticity calculated in terms of, why do I keep saying percent change in price, percent change in quantity supplied and demanded? The reason is because elasticity can be compared much more easily across a variety of different markets, where quantities might be measured in different units or prices might be measured in different currencies, if we use the percentage formula. Imagine, for example, that you were trying to compare how quantity demanded of gasoline responds to price, but you were comparing the United States versus, say, Europe or Latin America. Now, if you said for every dollar increase in the US, the result is 6 million gallons less gasoline demanded, and you start trying to compare that to, for every euro increase, how many liters of gasoline less are demanded, you're going to get all mixed up in the different units. You can't directly compare dollars per gallon in the US to euros per liter in other places, not to mention all the other currencies in the world. And so, if we're going to try and compare things at different times in different places, we need a measure that gets past different currencies, we need a measure that gets past different units, and we need to start looking at percentage change. Because percentage change allows us to say, well, the percent change in the price doesn't matter what currency was used. The percent change in quantity doesn't matter how quantity was measured. And it lets us have a measure which is essentially universal. Not only can we compare, say, gasoline in 2 different markets, but we can compare a wide variety of different goods. We can compare the elasticity of demand for gasoline with the elasticity of demand for beef, with the elasticity of demand for haircuts. They're all going to be percentage change in price, percentage change in quantity. And since it's all percentage change, we can compare elastic, inelastic, unitary elasticity across every market that's out there. So the use of percentage is actually a really functional, useful way of tackling the problem of coming up with a number which can be compared across a lot of different markets. Now, knowing whether demand or supply is elastic or inelastic is not just sort of an academic point. It has a wide range of applications for how prices should be set and how markets are going to react to shifts in demand and supply. Let me try and give you a few of those different implications. One example is that raising price will bring in more revenue if demand is inelastic, but raising price will not bring in more revenue if demand is elastic. Now, there was a lot of jargon there, I know, in that sentence, so let me sort of unpack it and try and give you a concrete example. Imagine that we're talking about a band, and it's on tour going from city to city, and it's playing in an indoor arena that has 15,000 seats. Now, let's keep this problem simple and sort of assume that the band keeps all the money it gets from ticket sales, and the band has to pay all the costs for its appearance. But the costs are things like travel and setting up the stage and stuff like that, so the costs are the same regardless of how many people are in the audience. And you have to get to the city and set up the stage and all that, regardless of how big the crowd is. And let's also assume that all the tickets have the same price, just to make life simple. The band knows that if it raises the price of tickets, it will sell fewer tickets. Now, the band wants to make the highest possible profits, so the band has to decide. Should it have a really high price, but not sell so many tickets, or should it have a lower price and sell a lot of tickets? Under the assumptions of this problem, the band is going to make the highest profit whenever it earns the highest revenue, because the costs of the band don't change according to how many people attend. Now, total revenue for the band will be the price times the quantity of tickets sold. Imagine the band starts thinking about this problem in concrete terms. It sets a certain price, and it expects that that price will result in the sale of a certain quantity of tickets. Imagine the band is only moderately popular, so it's not just going to sell out no matter what happens. If demand is elastic at that price level, then the band should cut the price from what it was thinking, because a percentage drop in price will result in an even larger percentage increase in the quantity sold. And if revenue is price times quantity, and price drops by some percentage but quantity rises by an even bigger percentage, then total revenue will go up. Now let's think about a super popular band. If the band is super popular, it's probably true that demand is somewhat inelastic. Then the band might want to keep raising the price of tickets, because in that case, a certain percentage increase in the price will result in a smaller percentage decrease in the quantity sold. And again, if you think about total revenue, price times quantity, if price goes up by some percentage, but quantity drops by a smaller percentage, then the total revenue the band gets will rise as it raises the price. And in fact, one of the interesting things, if you look at the concert industry over the last 10 or 15 years, is that lots and lots of bands have started charging much, much more for tickets than they did before. They've been following a strategy of trying to earn higher profits in their concerts. Now, if demand has a unitary elasticity at that quantity, then whatever the band does, a certain percentage change in the price would be offset by an equal percentage change in the quantity. And so in that case, the band makes essentially the same revenue, whether it increases or decreases the price of tickets, and it could just choose whether it would like a bigger crowd or a smaller crowd. Now, of course, the real world problem is more complex than the one I've given you here. It seems likely, for example, that some bands might start off charging a high price, and then if they don't fill up the space, maybe they offer special deals to try and fill up the space later on. Or some buyers might wait for the special deals, and so they don't buy at the high price, but they would be willing to if the price didn't go down. And tickets can be scalped, and there are all sorts of issues about how the pricing might happen over time. There's also a theory that some concerts, the bands may underprice the tickets a little bit because they want to encourage people to spend money on things like recordings and t-shirts and other kinds of paraphernalia, and they feel like if you get a good deal on the ticket, you're more likely to buy some of the other goods that might go along at the concert. But here's the key lesson. The key lesson from elasticity is that when a firm is thinking about setting its price, it can't just charge as much as possible. It shouldn't. It won't make sense for a firm just to charge as much as possible. Instead, the firm needs to consider what the elasticity of demand it faces is. And it needs to think about if it's inelastic or elastic. If it's inelastic, the firm might want to raise the price because it won't lose that much in sales. On the other side, if it's elastic, the firm will probably want to cut its price. Even a monopoly, even if no one else is selling the product, it won't simply raise the price as high as possible, unless there'll be some point where as it raises price, people just aren't going to buy the product. Here's another lesson. Demand and supply are often both more inelastic in the short run and more elastic in the long run. Again, let me try and unpack what that means. Think about demand for a concrete product like gasoline. Now, in the short run, as the price of gasoline goes up, what can you really do? You pay more on your heating bill, you pay more to fill up the tank of your car. Maybe you can do some stuff like turn your thermostat down a little bit lower in the winter, or try to bunch your car errands together so you can drive a fewer miles. But the elasticity of your demand in response to that price change is going to be pretty limited in the short term. It'll be inelastic. In the long run, if the price of energy or gasoline stays really high, you have a lot more options. Think about driving, for example. Over a period of years, you can buy a car that has better gas mileage. You can think about a permanent sort of carpool arrangement. In the 1970s, when oil prices and gasoline prices go way, way up, you see that kind of a shift from people driving big gas guzzlers to much smaller cars. Over time, people make choices about where to live and where to work. And if the price of transportation is high, many people will tend to live a little bit closer to where they work. They can set up carpools, van pools, different ways of getting to work. There can also be political pressure for things like better bus service or better mass transit if the price of gasoline is really high. In your house, you could hold down your energy bills by putting in better insulation, by buying energy-saving appliances. You might get used to wearing sweaters indoors all winter. Industry has a lot of options for investing in energy-saving stuff too over time. Just to give you a concrete example here, in 1983, U.S. petroleum consumption was 15.3 million barrels a day. Now that was actually less than the 17 million barrels per day that the U.S. economy consumed in 1973. It was even less than the 16 million barrels per day that the U.S. economy consumed in 1975, when oil exports to the U.S. were cut off for a time by OPEC. U.S. petroleum consumption was way down from 1973 to 1983, even though the U.S. economy was about 1/4 larger. And a lot of the reason was, with higher gasoline prices, people figured out ways to conserve on the energy they were using. Now, on the long term, on the supply side, producers of goods and services often find it easier to expand production in the long term of several years rather than in the short term of a few months. After all, if you're running a business in the short term, it can be pretty costly or pretty difficult to build a new factory, hire a bunch of new workers, open a bunch of new stores, all those kinds of big decisions. But over a few years, all of these things are possible. So in the short run, the response of quantity supplied to price might be fairly inelastic. But over time, as firms have a chance to adjust, it can be quite elastic indeed. Now, as a result of this sort of situation, what tends to happen in the economy is that prices jump up and down in the short run because demand and supply are both somewhat inelastic. But in the long run, the quantities adjust. The quantity demanded and the quantity supplied tend to move. And so the price might jump up and down, but it won't jump up and down as much in the long run. Let's try one more lesson. When demand is inelastic, increases in the cost of production can be passed along to consumers. But when demand is elastic, then increases in the cost of production have to be carried by the producers. Now, think about what this means for a moment. Again, we need to unpack some terminology here. Remember, an increase in the price of an input makes supply shift back, it makes it decrease. So the new equilibrium will have higher prices and lower output. But here's the question. Say if the price of gasoline goes up. We know there'll be higher prices and lower quantity produced for all the things that use gasoline and energy prices. But will it be mostly higher prices? In other words, can that higher price of gasoline be passed along to consumers? Or will it be mostly lower output, where the producers can't pass that along to consumers? Let me try and give you, again, some concrete examples to talk this through. Coffee shops use coffee as a key input, but they don't control the world market price of coffee. If the cost of coffee goes up, can they charge more to consumers in the form of higher prices? Well, if elasticity of demand for coffee is inelastic, then yes, they can just pass that price along to consumers. But if the elasticity of demand is very elastic, then no. If they try and charge more to consumers, people will just buy a lower quantity of coffee. And the firms have to just deal with that fact. Now, let's think about a slightly different example with some public policy implications. What would be the result of increasing a tax on cigarettes? You can think of a tax as like an input price. It's a price that's charged to the producer as they make the product. Now, let's think about the demand for cigarettes, and in all probability, the demand for cigarettes is pretty inelastic among regular smokers who are somewhat addicted. In fact, the evidence on this says that increasing the price of cigarettes by about 10% will lead to only about a 3% reduction in the quantity of cigarettes smoked. So the elasticity of demand for cigarettes is something like 0.3. If society increases taxes on companies that make cigarettes, then the companies can pass these taxes along to consumers in the form of higher prices. Higher taxes on cigarettes raise money for the government, but they don't affect the quantity of smoking by a huge amount. On the other side, there's some evidence that demand for cigarettes is more elastic among teenagers and those who aren't yet addicted or heavy smokers. So for that group, a tax on cigarettes might discourage them from continuing or from building up a cigarette habit, but it won't collect a whole lot of money for the government because they won't be smoking with the higher price. The enforcement of laws against the production or sale of illegal drugs offers another interesting application. Laws against illegal drugs can be viewed as raising the cost of producing and distributing those drugs. And many of the arguments over legalization of drugs are essentially arguments about elasticity. Like some people say, strict enforcement will cut drug use. What they're basically saying is strict enforcement will push up the price, and since demand for drugs is elastic, fewer people will use them. Other people say, no, strict enforcement only puts more money in the pockets of drug dealers. Well, what they're saying is strict enforcement will push up the price, they'll be able to pass that along to consumers, and there'll be more money for drug dealers. So those sorts of arguments are really assertions about elasticity of demand for illegal drugs. Now, the hard part about illegal drugs is we honestly don't have really good evidence on elasticities of supply and demand for illegal drugs. And so we don't honestly know how elastic or inelastic demand is. A few years ago in 2001, the prestigious National Research Council published a report on policy about illegal drugs. And this committee, which included some academic economists, concluded, viewing the unending public debate about drug policy, the committee became painfully aware that what we don't know keeps hurting us. And since then, there's a little evidence that actually demand for drugs is somewhat elastic. And so greater enforcement might discourage use, but the evidence is not especially strong. And until we know more, it's hard to know what the right policy would be for discouraging use of illegal drugs. The general concept of elasticity can be stretched to cover a lot of different situations where behavior is changing in response to changes in price. That includes situations involving how the quantity of labor responds to changes in income, or how the quantity of saving responds to changes in rate of return, and many other examples. So, for example, imagine you're interested in the question of, if we trim back on Social Security payments, will that encourage some elderly people to work rather than retire? So in terms of elasticity, the question is, what is the percentage change in hours worked that would result from a certain percentage change in Social Security payments? It's a question about elasticities. And elasticities for a specific age group, and it might be for specific levels of worker skill and so on. An awful lot of the Social Security reform debate is really an argument about elasticities, to which there isn't a real clear answer. Sometimes laws are proposed to increase the quantity of saving by offering tax breaks for saving, like through IRA accounts or something like that, individual retirement accounts. Will accounts like that increase saving? Well, in elasticity terms, the question is, what is the percentage increase in saving that would result from a certain percentage increase in the rate of return? The evidence on the supply curve of financial capital is somewhat controversial, but at least in the short run, the elasticity of saving with respect to interest rates and rates of return is pretty inelastic. And what that means in day-to-day English is tax breaks for saving cause people to move their existing saving into the tax-free accounts, but they don't seem to increase overall levels of saving by very much. Or imagine studying whether the IRS should spend more money auditing tax returns. In elasticity terms, what is the percentage change in tax collections derived from a percentage change in spending on tax enforcement? The evidence seems to be that if we audited more taxpayers, we'd collect more money, but it wouldn't particularly be a very popular choice. I hope that with all of these examples, you're getting sort of an underlying message. And like many of the messages in this course, it's not a lesson about the right policy or the wrong policy. It's a lesson about how to think about a certain kind of question and what the framework and the structure should be for thinking about that kind of question. The message in this case is that a lot of confident assertions you hear all the time about what will happen in various contexts, like what will happen if we tightened enforcement regarding illegal drugs, or what would happen if we fixed Social Security payments to encourage work, or what would happen if gasoline prices went up, really are all assertions about whether demand and supply in that particular situation are elastic or inelastic. Now, in social settings, this gives you something wise to say. For example, if someone says, a tax on gasoline would be a good way of encouraging people to drive less, you nod understandingly and you say, perhaps so, but of course, it all depends on the elasticity of demand for gasoline. And then you can shake your head thoughtfully, in a sort of a wise, balanced kind of way. Or someone might say, This country really needs tax-free savings accounts to encourage people to increase their saving. Well, you nod understandingly and you say, perhaps so, but of course, it all depends on the elasticity of supply of savings. And you shake your head thoughtfully like you're weighing the issues in your brain. I should warn you, though, from personal experience, that comments like this can either lead to a really much more intelligent and informed conversation, or they can lead the conversation to an abrupt and uncomfortable halt.